have all at your seat your briefing book. If you don't, let us know, but I don't have any more left, so I hope you all have one. And what we will kind of talk about, a quick rehash or review of what we were trying to do, and then a look at kind of the fruits of the discussions with the VFDs and then kind of the impact. We were asked during our multiple discussions to kind of look at different funding models, and we have those to show you today. So with that in mind, we want to review today the goals for the process, review the VFD budget process, review the general impact of the recommendation, including capital, staffing, and then look at some tax rate impacts. There's been a lot of questions. We watched the Fire Commission meeting and kind of went through that process to review those questions. Also, we've had various questions come in from commissioners and from the public. So what we've done is we've tried to answer each individual question. So we have a few questions we want to take a look at. With one of the things we had at our last meeting, we talked about tax rate. Was possibly looking at using the fire and EMS as a separate tax rate, what that looks like, and then based on direction and tentative approval moving forward. And if you remember back during our process, our discussion on how we handle the schools, where it's kind of what we refer to as our bifurcated process, what we're talking about today is kind of similar to the discussion in schools, with the exception this is related to fire departments and the VFDs. And the goal is to have the discussion, because they're such an important part of the community, to have the discussion of VFDs in isolation, just like to have the conversation with schools in isolation, because it's not a competition between the Sheriff's Department or Parks and Recreation and VFDs. It's a discussion about the needs of the VFDs and what the tax rates or fees or whatever the decision you guys make today is moving forward. So we wanted to have this discussion separate from the total budget. It will be included in your total budget recommendation, which you should receive in about 2 weeks, give or take. So that's kind of what we're going to talk through, and I'll try to be mindful of the time, Commissioner, to leave enough time at the end for the process that you have outlined. So with that, kind of the core principles that we worked on, or that we kind of started this process with, is we were looking at a uniform service, a level of service, regardless of the density. And what we found in the county is that depending upon where you live, there are different levels of service and different levels of funding and those things. So what we want to try to ensure is some uniform level of service, no different than kind of how we approached EMS. And that concept was based on how we approached the EMS service model in the fall with that working group. A uniform level of service regardless of ability to pay. The other thing we found, and I think that holds true, is that the structure of funding volunteer fire departments as it sits today is fundamentally broken. It started in the early 90s with the contracts, and the county began collecting the fees on behalf of the VFDs, and at that time they were going from bake sales and barbecues to fees, and it was envisioned to be a Band-Aid at that point, and it was $50. Then a second round of legislation came about that raised it to $100, and those are insufficient. So the funding structure, based on the changes in the way that fire service has to be provided, is insufficient. And what we've seen over the last few years in trying to ensure that there's equipment and funding for the necessary staffing is that the reliance on the general fund is growing, particularly in the 13 fire districts, or fire fee districts. So the challenge we had is looking at that and trying to ensure that regardless of where you are and regardless of the ability to pay, you receive a base level of service. And in addition to that, fire protection and suppression being part of the total effort, public safety effort in Union County. And I think Commissioner Rushing hit the nail on the head when he talks about, no matter where you are driving through this county, while you may pay your taxes and your fire fees at your house, you drive through all parts of this county, and if you're in a car wreck or if you're somewhere else in this county, you're going to expect whoever's closest, whatever VFD is there, to respond. So trying to ensure that we cover the full county and ensuring that there is enough funding to do that. Funding methods and levels are determined by the BOCC. You as the commission are the last stop for the funding decisions, whether it's tax rate, whether it's fee structure, whether it's supplement out of the general fund. Those decisions come to you as the Board of County Commissioners. And then again, we wanted to establish a funding method or a model that provided adequate staffing, equipment, and facilities across the entire county. And I think that, in everything we do, there's an underlying principle, and sustainability is that underlying principle. We don't really state it outright anymore because it's kind of a thread that runs through everything that we do. but I think it's important to realize that whatever funding method that we recommend, we're recommending it based on sustainability of funding. So that was kind of the problem we're trying to solve and the principles with which we went about solving that problem. It's a funding issue. The budget process for the VFDs, if you go back, what we're recommending is not a change in the process at this point, but a change in the funding method. The way it works, VFDs submit a line item budget request to the county manager. We review that request. We meet with the VFDs and our staff, including Curtis, myself, Cindy, the chiefs. At times they bring their board chairs. We meet with them and review their budget request. Then we take that request back with the notes that we glean, and those are very informational meetings. We talk about volunteers, their rosters, their status as far as a couple of them are probation, so forth, what their equipment needs are, what their staffing needs are. We compare that to the countywide staffing plan that the Fire Commission put together several years ago. The Horizon Needs Study, which presented their equipment needs over the next, a couple of years ago for a 4-year horizon, which we're just at the end of. And then other important information, like what their staffing levels are, if they need additional staff, equipment needs, those kinds of things. Then we develop a recommended budget based on the available funding and synthesizing that with the needs. And also at that time, we finalize our revenue estimates. We return those budgets then to the VFDs for their review. At that time, no different than anyone else that we work with, whether it's EMS, SPCC, any department, internal department, they are allowed or given the opportunity to come back and question the decision. And I think in this year's process, we had 2 that came back and talked to us specifically and look at that. And when we had made some assumptions and there was some information left out, so I think it was actually Wesley Chapel and Waxhaw came back. And I will be the first to tell you we don't always agree, but we try to come to some kind of agreement or at least know where we disagree on the levels of funding necessary for the VFDs. So that's kind of the process. The VFDs follow what I refer to as that modified zero base, not to the in-depth level that departments do, but it's kind of similar to how we handle our departments, our EMS and our SPCC, those groups. So the recommended VFD funding for 2016, and I apologize, the picture's a little grainy, it's about $13.4 million. And what we did is we went through this equation and looking at it, we wanted to set up an ongoing source of capital funding. And I think that that's very important. And Curtis and I were reviewing again today the fire study. And it's interesting because while we had looked at it, we arrived at our number a little differently than the fire study did that was done in 2012? 10, I'm sorry. Kind of came up with the same conclusion. We wanted to create a sustainable pot of capital money because what the issue we really find is that smaller VFDs particularly have a challenge getting and raising capital funds. The fees cover a large part of operations, but to go out and buy a truck, to go out and buy heavy apparatus, those things, it's a little more costly than those VFDs are able to take on, or they get in a situation where they have a bad loan with onerous terms, high interest rates, and those kinds of things. So to create a sustainable capital program, and this is no different, you've heard from me when we talk about creating capital programs for the schools, creating capital programs for the county, cash funding a sustainable program is essential to be able to continue to replace equipment. And the way that we arrived at that number is we looked at the number of stations, the number of apparatus, we determined what a reasonable replacement cycle would be, and based on our knowledge of what the cost of equipment is, we determined that about 1.6. And when you compare that to the fire study, I think the fire study 1.65. So we're right in that same neighborhood. And if you were to look at the 2016 recommendation this year, we have a handful of pieces of equipment. Fairview for a pumper truck, a rescue ATV and trailer for Jackson. Lanes Creek, this is the second half of a payment because last year they received cash funding that was the initial part of a brush truck replacement. Sandy Ridge with a tanker, Stack Road with a tanker truck. And these are different types of trucks. That's why you see a little bit of price variance. SCBA equipment for Stack Road. Stallings, one thing that you see SCBA on there. What we're encouraging the VFDs to do and what we're recommending our funding is instead of replacing a little bit every year over a number of years so that they're different pieces of equipment or different models to replace chunks at a time. While it seems like Stallings, we're replacing a lot of SCBA. If we replace entire fire departments each time, then that entire fire department's working with the same piece of equipment. And our recommendation, because Stallings had us last year for half that to fund that replacement, we said, well, let's wait a year, then we'll look at replacing it this year, and that's what this is, the fruition of that full replacement for Stallings. Waxhaw, due to some, I believe, zoning regulations and standards set up by the town, require a storage shed. And then Wesley Chapel is looking to upfit their fire truck, paying for that outright. And that, in their case, because you're looking at 1.6, how'd you get to 1.7? It's the 133 in fund balance at Wesley Chapel being used for their upfit. That's all the equipment you put on a fire truck after it shows up, and you put axes and hoses and everything else on it. In addition, one of the things we found was that to ensure proper coverage at the VFDs, to ensure that their staffing and their turnout is there, they had asked across the county for different levels of staffing. Some include changes in the way they pay their stipends or they pay for call, because no two systems are exactly the same in each of the VFDs. So we recommended different levels in different places, obviously. And I won't go down through the list, but these are the personnel changes, and they range everything from the implementation of a pay-per-call program to additional full-time staffing on the weekends, to nighttime staffing, to different things. I will tell you the one thing we didn't recommend is any additional chief stipends or salaries, because at this time we felt with making a change and having to add to tax rates in different places, this was not the year to add chief salaries to the equation. So we didn't recommend, I believe there are 2 fire departments that requested that. We did not recommend that to you. So going down through, and there's differences you can see. For instance, one slot at Baker's, the cost of that is different than one slot at Hemby Bridge, and it has to do with differences in the way they pay for their slots, certification pay, all these different things. Like I said, they're all vaguely similar but completely different from that perspective. So these are the costs based on what we were told or what was requested from each of the VFDs as far as additional staffing. In addition to that recommendation, we with a county-wide system, there are a few things we felt like that needed to occur. The first was, because Monroe is truly the only city that provides full fire service, we felt like there needed to be some funding that goes back to Monroe based on the county-wide funding model. And that is equivalent to a penny of the Monroe tax rate, on the Monroe tax rate. It's not ideal, and I think it's a complicated solution to this problem. We have a very imperfect system of funding now. This isn't the perfect solution, but in any version of this, there's not a perfect solution, particularly when it comes to Monroe, because they are the only full-service city and the only ones that provide fire completely. Otherwise, the other towns, particularly the ones that we've heard mentioned, Marshville, Wingate, and Weddington, are all served by VFDs that have funding that come from this model. So Monroe is the only one that does not have funding that comes through this model. In addition, what we found was that as we went through the line items, the VFDs wanted to buy radios for essentially put on a shelf as backups in case radios broke. Well, it's the county's radio system they're joined onto. So what we recommended is that the county maintain a stock and a technician of radios and radio technician to be able to fix and replace and manage that program. And then if a VFD has a radio problem, they just need to call us, let us know, and we'll swap them radios and work with them to get those replaced. But we can do it by buying 10 radios versus buying 30 radios across the entire county if we have a centralized pool of radios. And from that perspective, it's part of our radio system anyway, and we felt like that we could do that and actually in some ways improve that service. So there's $100,000 in the county-wide budget for that. In addition, one of the challenges we have is consistent data across the entire county, and all the way from definitions to reliability of the current system for collecting data. Right now, not all VFDs are on the same. Sorry about that. Okay. not all VFDs are on the same data collection tool. And what we had money in this year's budget in the general fund for the first time purchase of Firehouse software, which will put all VFDs on the same reporting platform. It's web-based, doesn't require the VFDs to maintain anything on site, is my understanding. And what this would allow us then to do is get consistent data points across the entire county. If you remember back during the EMS discussion, one of the hardest parts we had to do was come up with a way to make all the data fit. Because in some cases, what EMS called a call and what EMS called a priority call were different than what our 911 center called a priority call. You kind of have that same thing going on in the VFDs, where some VFDs count car wrecks as fire calls, some count them as medical calls. So if you ask the question broadly, how many calls did you run and what's the mix medical to fire, depending on which VFD you're talking about, there's not a consistent data point to compare against. So implementation of this countywide data system would allow the entire county to be tracked and would allow those data points to be available to us for reporting purposes and for planning in the system. In addition, to kind of make the whole, make the numbers work, because if you've ever done a mortgage, you know there's a little bit of aggregate adjustment at the end. We had $108,000, which is on the county tax rate, is out in the 4th, 5th place in the decimals for future rate smoothing. And this would be just a jump start on next year to be able to address different needs if we needed to, without having a necessary increase in the tax rate. It's not a lot of money when it comes to the tax rate. It was really there to kind of smooth, go from 0.39 to 0.4. Not particularly meaningful, but it was kind of a rounding issue to be able to balance out. So with that recommendation then, we were asked to essentially look at really 5 types of tax models, and I think are funding models. And I think it was very interesting to us because while we had kind of done this in isolation, we hadn't done this exercise universally across the county. And when we looked at it, what we had to do was convert the fire fee districts to effective tax rate. And when we say effective tax rate then, and you'll see it in multiple slides as we go through this, when we say effective tax rate, we mean the tax rate that the taxpayer actually pays, whether that is through a $100 fire fee or through the fire tax or some hybrid version of that, including what they already pay in the general fund. Now, one thing you see on here, if you count them down, there's 17. There's not 18. This analysis at this point has about $40,000 included for Providence. That is the funding necessary, we believe necessary, from the county to service about 1,400 parcels that are not in the Weddington area, that are in the county area. Because not all of Providence Fire District where it runs is in Weddington. Up to that point, they're not included in any of this analysis. And we do not have, at this point, an answer as to what the total impact of that decision is, because this is it's something that we haven't worked through on our side. And to my understanding, the fire department and the town of Weddington and all those folks are still kind of working through what they're going to do. And once that's complete, then we'll have to step back and see what the county's role in that's going to be. But from a funding perspective, they're not included in these tax analysis. They represent about 1,400 parcels, and it's about, right now, the amount that we have included is about $40,000 for them. So if you're counting down and you're looking, you won't see Providence in this equation on any of these charts. So with that in mind, the question was raised, what if we go to, and we've heard this discussion a lot, what if you went to 18 tax districts? You have 2 Chapter 69 districts in Stallings and Hemby, and the rest are Chapter 153 districts. So Waxhaw, Wesley Chapel, and Mineral Springs or Springs. What would happen if you went and did that everywhere? So this is kind of how it played out. And Wesley Chapel, and I'll tell you, in all of these calculations, Wesley Chapel is kind of a net donor in the discussion because of the value of their housing. These would be the tax rates in each of those individual districts if you were to go to a straight tax model. And you can see as you get down, Jackson, which is your kind of one of your lowest cost, if not the lowest cost VFD in the equation, would be about 4.62, and then it grows from there all the way down to Stack Road would be about 20 cents. And this, of course, is tax rates in pennies. And this is based on the 2016 recommended budget. So you would see all the different levels of funding. And I tried to get it all on one graph because I know that's how I like to see it, but it just wasn't suitable for presentation. The other question we had is, at 18 fee districts, what would that look like? And these, of course, are based on the median home values in each of these districts. At a $100 fire fee, which all districts would be at a $100 fire fee, this would be the effective tax rate within those districts. And that would essentially then be two parts. The $100 fire fee converted to a tax rate on a medium home, and then about 2 cents countywide tax rate to make up the difference in that fire district for the amount of funding needed to operate that is not generated by the $100 fire fee. There is not a district in this county, based on the 2016 funding, that can operate on a $100 fire fee. Not any of the tax districts, even Wesley Chapel cannot operate. And the challenge there is because of density issues. Bakers and Jackson were the only two that did it in 2015. And that was because in Jackson, their budget is so low. And in Bakers, their density is so high, they were able to function on that $100, lower than $100. In fact, I think Jackson was in the $65, $66 range, and Bakers was right around $89, $90. But under this model, if you were to look at 18 fee districts, it'd be $100 everywhere plus 2 cents in the general fund to cover them, or 2 cents on your countywide tax rate. The current hybrid model, meaning when we say current, this is how you funded everyone in 2015. This would carry all of the fire fees in the county up to $100, and then the necessary, on top of that, then the necessary countywide cost in the 2016 budget. So you can see then again Wesley Chapel effective tax rate, if funded at the 2016 level, goes up to 393, and this includes then all the current values as well for 2016. You go all the way down to Beaver Lane. Even under this current model, the effective tax rate paid by an average house in that district is about 9.7 cents. So you see it ranges all over, and this is due to, in some cases, low values in the districts. But again, all of your fire fees would have to be set at 100, and then you need about 1.2 cents in addition to the fire fee structure to cover the 2016 recommendation. So with that, we've been kind of working through then what are some alternatives, because we think in looking back at these other tax models and these other versions that we think we need to do better for the taxpayer. That in those versions, there are some tax rates, regardless of which of the first three versions you look at, that are onerous and are punitive to the taxpayer. So in looking at it, what we tried to come up with was the lowest impact, lowest cost model for the taxpayer. And this is the recommendation that we have for you to move forward with what we refer to as a recommended hybrid. It's a modification of what you do now, which would reset all of those fire fees to zero, would set your one of your 5 tax districts tax rate to zero, and the other 4, it would set them to a comparable rate above the 440. Under this model, in the tax districts, with the exception of Wesley Chapel because it's a net donor district, all of the funding from the 4.4 would stay in the tax district, and then the additional tax or supplemental tax on top of that, because you can see down below in Stallings, Springs, Waxhaw, Hemby Bridge, they're above the 4.4 level. Those are localized taxes to provide essentially their request this year for additional staffing and or part of their tax rate that was above or they would have already, that they'd already paid that was necessary to fund them in their district at the level they had requested. So if you were to implement this hybrid model across the county, you would see a 4.4 tax rate, with the exception of those bottom 4 units. And that's mainly driven, again, in Stallings by its capital and personnel, in Springs by its general cost, and Waxhaw because they're proposing adding about $250,000 in personnel. And then in Hemby Bridge, they're adding about $155,000 in staffing. In addition, under this model, what we tried to do is hold all of the tax districts harmless to the sales tax recalculation. As you know, sales tax is based on levy, and the county, with its increase in tax last year, will get a greater percentage sales tax, and that's from everywhere, whether it's from a town or any of these tax districts. So what we tried to do is hold those fire tax districts harmless in that calculation, because what we didn't want was to increase sales tax to the general fund and at the same time be raising the tax rate in those taxing districts to be able to give that sales tax back to the general fund. So we believe we held pretty much everyone harmless in this conversation from a fire fee district or a fire tax district comparison. And then the last option, if you remember, we looked at what is the countywide, if you went with just a straight out countywide tax for fire service and you didn't have any supplemental rates in the county, what would that look like? Our estimate is it's about 4.7 cents would get you from where you are with the various tax rates under this version, would get you to a straight out countywide tax funding model. Okay. Are there any questions on the tax rates about the calculation or how we got there to them? Because I think this is, I know from my perspective, this is why we're recommending the change at this point, is because I think we can benefit the taxpayers. So,
would Monroe and Weddington fall in the 440 range?
I can't tell you where Monroe would be because we don't do their budget. Weddington would be served by the VFDs in this case that are getting funding under this. So Wesley Chapel, Providence, whatever the case may be in that case, and then Stallings are the three VFDs that serve that area, and they're getting significant funding through this model.
And I wasn't thinking funding, but the taxation. Monroe residents will get a 440, and Weddington will get a 440 as well.
Yes.
As most of these. Okay.
They absolutely would. And I'm going to address that in the questions, but I think you make a valid point in that the way county services are funded and the way countywide services are funded, there are times when you cannot avoid taxing within the municipalities for services the county provides that municipality has chosen to also provide a supplemental level of service. And probably the best example of that is when you look around the county and you see a Waxhaw police car, you see a Stallings police car, you see a Monroe police car, you see a Wingate police car. All of those districts pay 10 cents, or all those towns already pay 10 cents for the sheriff's department, in addition to having their own localized police department. So I think that's I think it's a very good point that you bring up. Those residents within those two specific areas would be paying the 4.4 cents, and that's why we felt, at least with Monroe, because Monroe isn't serviced by any of those VFDs, that they should at least get back some of that funding for fire purposes. Now, in our discussions, at least at the staff level, is that funding comes with no strings, so the Monroe City Council can do as they choose with that funding, whether they apply it to their tax rate, apply it to capital. I mean, our thinking was that it would be sufficient to help offset cost of apparatus and equipment, which always seems to be the big hang with fire departments. So, but that's a good question, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about it in the question and answers, but it's a good point.
So just so I understand, you're looking at a difference in budget from last year of about 2.5 million? So without changing the funding formula, you're looking at just over a penny increase, leaving the funding methodology exactly the same.
You would be looking at, it's about a half cent.
Okay.
Okay. And
So we can do everything that's being asked in the budget for a half cent increase versus the 4.4.
But you'd also, in some places, you would see the fire fee go all the way up to the 100, and that fire fee would remain in place. So your the thing is, and the way to look at that is through the effective tax rate calculation. Is if you look at, for instance, under this current hybrid model, this answers your question. If you went with what you do now, the $100 fire fee with the general fund supplement, this is the effective tax rate in each of these districts. So your resident, let's pick one in the middle, Stack Road, for instance. Your resident in Stack Road under the hybrid model that we're proposing would pay 4.4 cents. Under the hybrid version that we have now, that average person's paying 7.1 cents
Flat $100.
with the $100. Okay, and what that comes down to is to generate $100 of tax at the 4.4, your house has to be worth about $260,000. So everybody on the lower end of that $260,000 in a fire fee district is going to see a benefit from that. And even in the tax districts, for instance, Hemby Bridge, if you were to use Hemby Bridge and you weren't doing you were doing the current version where we put all of their cost onto their tax rate, their rate would be almost 6.1 cents. Under the proposed hybrid, their rate's 5.91 cents. So you're looking at about 0.2 of a penny. It's not a ton because Hemby Bridge was right at break even this year on the reval. But for places like Waxhaw, under the hybrid that we're proposing, you're looking at 5.6 cents. Under the other version, you're looking at about the same. So generally, the idea was to keep everybody roughly the same in the tax districts, with the exception of their new requests, and then try to relieve some of the pressure on that $100 rate. And as the further you get away from that 260, the more tax rate it costs to have that $100 fire fee. And again, going back, if you remember back to our original discussion, and that's mostly due because firefighting doesn't cost any less necessarily. It's a readiness to serve charge. So the type of house you own doesn't necessarily equate to the value of the cost of the service. And the fee structure for fire is a fundamentally flawed theory for funding public safety. You know, you don't pay the sheriff for every time he comes to your house, or EMS. Well, you do pay for EMS, but they don't show up if you haven't paid. They don't not show up if you haven't paid your bill. So that was kind of the theory behind it, was to try to get those folks that are on the $100 fire fee to pay a reasonable tax rate, essentially for their fire service, because at a $100 fire fee, they are paying that, what we would consider a fairly high tax rate.
And I just want to make sure that we're very clear that the additional half cent is in addition to the 0.67 cents that is already being levied out of the general fund.
Right. Regardless of which way you go, whether you take the staff recommendation, you go back to the original recommendation, or you go with some version of these other options, it's our position that this should absolutely be broken out from the general county operations, and that this should be clearly identified on your tax bill as a service that that you receive from the county. Because Cindy's exactly right. What we've run across also is this thought that in some way the general fund was not supporting the VFDs. Well, that's not at all true. There was a 0.67 in 2015 used in the general county tax rate to fund VFDs. In fact, most of the fee districts, with the exception of 2, Bakers and Jackson, were in some form or fashion already receiving general fund subsidy. So we think that it's a transparency issue, that improving the transparency in the tax bill, much like we did with schools, that we can add to the transparency in the tax bill by breaking it out. And we have a little bit of discussion, because I think one of the things we wanted to look at was what happens if you break out EMS and fire into a separate line. So with that, let's kind of talk about some of the questions we've heard. The first, how will the VFDs plan for the future under the recommended hybrid funding plan? I think it's important to note that the process for the allocation of funding has not changed. And in fact, I wouldn't expect it to change. That process, being your representative is in that process for the board and the taxpayers countywide, we want to go through that process every year to look at the individual needs. My suggestion to you is that this would not change the way the VFDs plan and or budget. That they would still come through that same modified zero-based process. We would review their requested needs against the information we have and make a recommendation. So, I know there was a lot of conversation then about how would they move forward. Well, this is only a change in the funding methodology, not a change in the way that they are requesting and or planning for their services. I think it's important to note that from the VFD side of the equation, their funding isn't changing under this model. We did the recommendation you have for expenditure funding is based on what we believe the appropriate funding is for fire in the county, not based on the funding model itself. So keeping that in mind, I wouldn't anticipate that the way that that's requested would change at all. And I think they would continue to plan as they always have. So under the recommended hybrid model, who will own the trucks? I know Chief Canup is concerned about that. Under this version, the county, there's a lot of options, but I don't envision from a staff side of us buying the trucks or titling the trucks to the county. We can help the VFDs by paying the invoice directly. They can submit for reimbursement. That's how we handle SPCC, schools, even HealthQuest. When you appropriated funding for a computer system and HVAC to them in the fall, all they have to do is submit their receipts or submit the invoice and tell us who to pay, as long as they verify they received it, and we'll pay that. There's not an intent on the county's part to own any of these trucks. If we own them, we have to go through the process of giving them to the VFD, and I don't think that that's a necessary component. However, I think it is recommended that as we go through these discussions, that any of those trucks purchased with tax dollars, and I think this is regardless of what funding mechanism you use, that any of those trucks funded with tax dollars should revert to the county should that VFD dissolve, such that the county would then be able to use those trucks to fix that service gap if there is a service gap. And it makes sense. We're not asking for trucks that were paid for with donations. We wouldn't be asking for trucks that were paid for through alternative means. And this would be an easy transition, an easy way to track it if we were paying for the trucks outright on behalf of the VFDs. And this is a perfectly legit and legal way to do it in discussions with Jeff and how we finance stuff all the time. So the county has no intention of owning the trucks. What we do want to help them get the lowest cost, so there may be some efficiency if we buy multiples at one time, or another version of that. We do want to help them get the lowest cost possible, but we have no intent of owning those trucks out from underneath the VFDs.
Jeff, can I ask you a question, please,
Sure
sir?
can.
What's our history of giving out trucks? I mean, we gave one last year, and we've got at least 4 this year, plus an ATV. I mean, have we historically given out 3 or 4 trucks a year?
No, I don't believe we've given out that many. I don't think the commission has approved in the past funding for that many. The challenge we have is that in some of the cases, a truck could be 3 times the annual budget of some of these VFDs at this point. And the reason we're recommending these is in meeting with those VFDs and talking through the funding mechanisms they were using. In some cases, they're not able to get funding. In other cases, and I hate to use this word, but predatory lending practice, where the mechanisms that are available to them because of their credit worthiness, just because they're small in their income and they're relying on the county to some degree in donations, that they have high interest rates and bad terms. So in lieu of high interest rates and bad terms and not being able to best provide for that equipment and taking money out of operations and service side to be able to fund increased interest costs and those things, it's a better, and I have this in here somewhere too as well, it's a better process for the county to be able to cash fund those trucks and ensure that there is sufficient funding to buy the truck that the VFD needs to service their service area. Otherwise, if we waited until the VFDs had sufficient funding or were able to borrow at a sufficient rate that it didn't impact services, then they may not get a truck. And in some cases, some of these trucks are 20, 30 years old. So it's our recommendation, and I believe this is also out of the fire study, that you would move forward with, regardless of what you do with some kind of county pool for capital funding. Now, each VFD won't get a truck every year, but working through this model, we can prioritize and ensure that the VFDs get the trucks they need in a timely manner. And that ensures then that they have trucks they need to show up for the residents and to be able to fight the fires and respond in emergencies that they need.
One of the things we saw when we were going through the budget process is that some of the, and really the VFDs that are on the fire fee, not those with taxing district, let there be light. Primarily, some of them, when we spoke to them, it was not, I need a truck. Now it was, I can afford to pay for a truck in 5 years. So that's when we have slated it. So many times we found that the financial issue was what was controlling truck replacement, not the condition of the equipment or the apparatus.
And I think that falls in line with how we fund other emergency services and even services in the county. The sheriff is on a replacement program, for instance, with his cars. We replace them as he needs them. I don't think we want to put ourselves in a position, particularly in public safety, where we are only replacing vehicles at the time we can save up over years to do it. And in addition, if they were to run out and be able to borrow that high cost of borrowing is passed right back to the general fund because they're already at $100. So they add that truck payment interest, that all gets passed back to the general fund either way. So to ensure, on a county-wide perspective, it's a small impact. In an individual VFD, it's a large impact to be able to fund a truck for their needs and for their purposes. Do you have a question?
So, Jeff, are you saying that that the ability to supply the needs for those trucks for the various departments would be independent of what we had available in that capital fund that we were setting aside? Does that make sense? In other words, if you came up this year and you had more demand, you had more need for trucks, for whatever reason, you had 6 departments that needed new trucks, but you only had X number of dollars set aside in that capital fund, that's not going to affect the decision as to whether those individual units get those trucks. Is that right?
What we would do is, and what we find a lot of times in discussion is a VFD will ask for a truck, but it may not be ready to purchase the truck, but it wants to get it on the discussion and on the radar. So what we would do then is look at those trucks and see who's ready to purchase those and who's first in line, first in that process. A truck takes anywhere from 9 to probably 18 months, depending upon the type of truck, to get it in once you order it. So, that can cross fiscal years and those things. So what we did is we took the Horizon Needs Study, which was an equipment study done several years ago through the Fire Marshal's office in conjunction with the VFDs. It's before I got here, so that's why I'm looking at Cindy.
Manager's office through Matthew.
Right. So we took that Horizon Needs Study, and it had slated out over a 4 or 5 year window what the equipment needs were. So using that kind of as a guide to help prioritize. In addition, in our conversations with the VFDs, we ask a lot of questions about how old your trucks are, what's your next need of replacement. So we balance that. I'm not saying that we would recommend limitless funding for capital, but like we would do in our own fleet, we prioritize and say, okay, in the highest need area in this case would probably be the oldest truck that's closest to the end of its life. This would be the first, and we work our way down the list. So yeah, there's always going to be something at the bottom of that list which we wouldn't recommend replacing, but it's not going to be a piece of apparatus that would be mission critical that we believe, and in conjunction with discussions with the VFD, would impact public safety. Now, I would suggest to you probably toward the top of that list, there's some of those types of things that if we don't get them replaced or we don't get them started in a replacement, then there may be some issues. But generally what comes out on the bottom will be the top or toward the top of the next year, and it can wait till that next cycle. It's kind of you have to feel your way through it because of the way they're 18 individual departments. You have to have individual conversations and kind of sift through some of that to be sure that we prioritize that equipment throughout that process. And I think that the past couple of years we've tried to do that as much as possible and address trucks that we believed were really needed. I can promise you that from a staff perspective, we do not recommend trucks we do not think are necessary. In our own process, I wouldn't recommend cars or sheriff's vehicles that I didn't think were appropriate or necessary, and we take that same litmus test that we apply to everything else and apply it to that. And it's the same process we use for EMS as well. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yes.
Is there an issue with using ad valorem taxes to fund VFDs? And I think there's a little bit of confusion about this because there's 2 components. The county's already funding VFDs with ad valorem taxes. The 5 tax districts are using ad valorem taxes for their total funding. So in those 5 tax districts, that is an ad valorem tax. So it's a tax on cars, a tax on property, business property, all those components. In addition, because the county is already funding VFDs out of the general fund, we are funding them with a 0.67 in 2015, a 0.67 ad valorem tax. It just happens at this point to be buried into your total tax rate, so you really don't see it. So that, from that perspective, you've already kind of gone down that road. It's just a matter of degrees at this point, and do you keep the $100 fire fee in that discussion? So this has come up several times, and I just want to be sure that we're real clear that you're already funding fire with ad valorem taxes on a countywide basis and in the 5 tax districts. Are there any questions? Why is this just now being discussed? Because I think one of the things we heard at the Fire Commission the other day is why just now, and why did this seem to come out of the blue? I know personally I've been working on this issue for the last 3 years and my entire time here at the county. My understanding is that the BOCC charged the Fire Commission in 2012 with coming up with a recommendation for fire funding, and I don't believe that was done. The issue has been included in the manager's plan of work as approved by the BOCC. So this isn't a new issue that we're trying to deal with. This system has been broken all the way back to the point where they went to the state legislature and had special legislation to up the fire fee. And I would argue even going all the way back to the point where the county started collecting the fire fee on behalf of the VFDs, that was acknowledgement, at least in part, that the fire fee structure is not a long-term sustainable option. And I think the other issue that you can see is that we're one of 2 counties authorized to do the fire fee in the entire state, so 2 out of 100. And then in addition, the other county that does it now is getting, from our understanding, is getting out of their fire fee process. So this isn't a new issue that just cropped up that we just started to address. In fact, I think even going back as early as last year, it was part of the budget focus points and trying to work through this issue. So it's not a completely new issue. It's been worked on for the last several years, even going back multiple years through different various formations. If Monroe gets funding, why not the other towns? And I talked to this a little bit earlier. Monroe is the only city that provides a standalone fire service. The rest of these towns, and particularly I'm thinking of Mineral Springs, I'm sorry, not Mineral Springs, Marshville, Wingate, Weddington, and Monroe. If you're not familiar with, Wingate is the only one that's a donut hole, if you will. We don't charge fire fee for the Wingate VFD within the city limits, our town limits of Wingate. They choose to pay through municipal contract. However, in Marshville, we collect fire fees inside the city limits of Marshville. So from that perspective, in Marshville, there's not a real change. In Wingate, they forced a change this year anyway in the way that they funded their VFD through their municipal subsidy. Wingate is building a new fire station, and I think that that's fine. That's not an issue. But in doing so, the town, and in conjunction with the VFD, determined that the town would no longer contribute to the annual operations of that. They were paying $20,000 annually, and that's been withdrawn and given in lieu, given the building and the maintenance in that building. But the budget for Wingate didn't go down from an operations perspective. So the county had to come in, or has to come in now, and backfill that operational money as is. So in our recommendation, the reason we have Monroe slated for additional funding and then the remainder of the VFDs to be funded under the model is because the remainder of the VFDs do serve the rest of the county. It's only in the case of Monroe that they don't in some form or fashion. So that goes back to that original recommendation, that original discussion.
Excuse me.
Yes, sir.
Please explain Wingate again. They were doing municipal funding of the fire department.
Wingate was giving $20,000, I believe it was $20,000 a year through a contract to the Wingate Volunteer Fire Department to respond to calls within Wingate. We did not collect a fire fee for the Wingate Fire Department there. So when they built their new building, or in the process of building their new building, they are no longer going to receive that $20,000 contractual subsidy from the town of Wingate. However, that was $20,000 that wasn't originally used to pay for a new building. So the county has to backfill whatever shortage that creates, or there has to be a service reduction in Wingate to cover that difference. Does that make sense? They were getting $20,000 of cash. Now they're getting a new building, which a new building's great, but you still have $20,000 of cost operationally that they're now not getting funded through Wingate because Wingate has chosen in lieu of to give them a building.
How does that work with districts? Because Mineral Springs, which you and I live in, you know, the taxes that are collected on fire tax in that area can only be spent in that particular geography,
That's
in their
right.
fire district. So Wingate was a municipal. What's going to make them any different than Weddington when Weddington says we're not going to support? We're going to backfill that? I mean, it's
That's the
same
question.
thing.
That is absolutely the question, because when these municipalities have the choice. All municipalities have the choice, as Monroe has chosen, to provide a higher level or an additional level of service within their municipal boundaries. That is their decision, their choice. If they choose to not do that, then I think that those VFDs or whoever is serving in that capacity then becomes subject to the determination by you as a commission of how you're going to fund it and the standard to which you will fund it. Typically what you see is within those municipal boundaries is a higher level of service than what would be necessarily the state base level of service. So as a commission, it would be at that point that you would have to decide how you're going to fund that fire department, or if you're going to fund them. So, you know, it's going to be it's a case-by-case situation, and that was some of the discussion we had with the folks in Weddington. Is if you want your fire service to be at a certain level, there's no guarantee if the county picks that ball up to fund it that you as a commission will be willing to tax or to fund at that level, up or down. And we haven't got to that discussion, so I can't tell you how that would turn out, because I think it's a case-by-case discussion. But absolutely, if a municipality determines that they no longer want to fund those VFDs and the supplements that they're giving, then I think it's up to you as a board. Do you backfill? You have a non-supplanting policy at this point, which says if state funds, federal funds, local funds go away from someone funded within the county, that it's not an automatic assumption that the county is going to pick that funding up. And I think this case, if there were municipal subsidy withdrawn, you would have to make that funding decision. For our purposes, in the recommendation you have, where we had to make up that gap for Wingate, we're recommending you make up that gap to maintain the service level in Wingate.
That's the first I heard it, and that's why I was confused.
Does that kind of answer your question? Why cash funding apparatus versus debt funding? I know I heard, you know, the discussion about why would we pay cash for these when the VFDs can go borrow. Well, we've already kind of covered that not all the VFDs can borrow at a suitable rate. In addition, you've charged us with trying to give you a sustainable funding model. Adding to the debt in these communities and adding to the debt in these individual fire departments and making them more reliant on the general fund to fund that debt is not a sustainable solution. In addition, it starts to strip away your flexibility. So over years, what you'd be paying is you'd bury yourself into debt, and you would not have flexibility to make decisions about when you needed apparatus or what apparatus needed to be made, because you have the cumulative impact of all of those individual debt decisions will eventually start to build up. This, in my mind, is not completely different than where we are in the general fund, from kind of having that debt burden be such a onerous burden on the taxpayer that we have a lot of discussion always about should we use additional debt, should we be moving forward with debt. We had a lot of discussion this spring about should we be moving forward with bond election because of the level of debt. So I think you as a board have kind of signaled to us as staff that bringing on new debt or creating more debt commitment for the county or the general fund is not a direction you want to go, and we agree, and we think it's not a sustainable strategy. The sustainable strategy is develop a ongoing cash funding source for that capital replacement, because that provides you the most flexibility over time to do the things you need to do, to make decisions you need to, and to kind of adapt or react to that changing service delivery model need. Did the county work with the municipalities to establish the hybrid funding model? We had discussions of late. I believe Cindy talked this to the manager, and
I met with the city manager of Monroe last week, and I know Jeff had a conversation with the Monroe fire chief, I think it was a couple of weeks ago.
right. But I will tell you, in our service delivery model, it is not a normal practice for us to go through and talk about how the county is going to deliver services or fund those services with the municipalities. You as a board have the responsibility and discretion to establish the tax rate for the entire county. This is, to us, is a county-wide issue, is a county funding issue. We don't consult the municipalities when we're talking about funding for parks and recreation, when we're talking about funding for libraries, sheriff's funding, or any of those. So it's not part of our normal practice to do that. And in the cases where municipalities would like to change that or to do something different, they have all, again, they have all the opportunity on their, within their boundaries to establish fire service at a level they would like. There's nothing to keep any of those municipalities from moving forward with that model, as some have chosen to do. Shouldn't the VFDs decide on the mechanism for funding the fire services within the county? I think the challenge you run into in this case is that you have 18 individual districts with 18 individual needs, 18 individual structures, 18 individual components. You as a board are the only group, and us staff as your surrogate in this case, are the only folks that have that global picture of what the entire fabric of public safety within the county is meant to be, or at the level that you as a board want it to be. And I think that it's entirely appropriate, and I think we answer this question in a couple of minutes, it's entirely appropriate to talk with the VFDs about the service delivery aspects of what we want, what we need them to do, and what we would want them to do, and how best to provide fire service and rescue services. But concerning a funding structure, the funding mechanism, if you will, I believe it's appropriate for you as a board to decide that and for us as staff to recommend it. I don't believe that the 18 individual fire districts, it's appropriate for them to recommend to you what those funding mechanisms are. And I don't think you as a board can or should abdicate that responsibility to the VFDs, but you should rely on the same folks that recommend all of your tax rates to help you set that tax rate or set that fee rate. And this is no change and no difference than how it's been done historically. The county has always recommended the level of funding necessary, the level of the fee and the tax rates, whether it's a tax district or a tax fee or a fire fee, the level of the fee or the level of tax necessary to fund the VFDs. We think it's important for them to focus on service delivery and providing those services, not necessarily on where that money comes from. I think we had the same discussion. We'll talk a little bit about similarities with EMS in just a moment. But I think it's important to note that I don't believe the VFDs, those are the individuals appropriate for recommending to you a funding structure. Does it really lead to a one-size-fits-all approach? We heard a lot of, we're going to make everyone have the same tanker truck or have everyone have the same this, same that. The process is established around the state basic standards. And then in addition, the process is built on individual conversations and a review of individual needs at the department level, then a recommendation on the individual departments. There are some departments that can turn out enough folks with their volunteers that they don't require any paid staff. I believe we have 3, 4 of those in the county. I think it's
Probably not
3.
anymore. You might have 2 now.
That have no paid volunteers. And those typically are on the east side of the county and the more rural areas. Well, further west, you probably do have a need for full-time staffing because there's not enough volunteers. They can't turn out enough, just pure volunteers. So it's less about ensuring that everyone gets the same thing. But it's as much as it's about ensuring everyone gets what they need to do what they need to do at the agreed upon or at the state prescribed basic level. That's unique to each individual fire district. So no, it doesn't lead to a one-size-fits-all. What it leads to is ensuring that base level of service, no matter where you are, because, you know, if you live out in a very rural part of the county, a ladder truck's not going to do you any good to help you put out your brush fire. But you may need additional brush truck. Or you talked about the ATV and the recommendation. A ladder truck's not going to do much good at Cane Creek if you're stuck off on a trail somewhere. Being able to get to you with the appropriate equipment necessary in that VFD is what you need at that time. So in our conversations with the VFDs, that's the process we use. It's generally specific to the department while trying to ensure that level of service. And it meets specifically the needs individually, not a standardized across the board. We're gonna have everybody have a certain size tanker or a certain type of brush truck or a certain type of truck. But it relies on being sure that they have the equipment they need based on what they've requested to us. Does this ultimately lead to a county-run fire service? We've heard all kinds of interesting discussion about this. Everything from we're trying to completely engulf the fire service to Curtis has gone out and purchased his fire chief's uniform already. This is not the intent of at least this management staff, and I don't believe it's the intent of the board. We're under no direction nor have any recommendation to move forward implementing a county-wide fire service. So I want to publicly state that that is not the intent of this process. The intent of this process is to ensure that the VFDs have what they need to provide the services at the level that you as a commission expect them to provide services at. Is the reason the county staff does not support 18 tax districts because the county would lose sales tax dollars. The calculation for sales tax is based on ad valorem tax levy. While it may be true that if the county implemented 18 tax districts, there would be a change in how sales tax would be allocated, that's just one of the many factors impacted in sales tax. Sales tax allocation changes are in a year lag, meaning the 2016 sales tax allocation will be based on the 2015 levy. So what you have to be able to make a determination that there's going to be an impact is every tax rate in the county. County tax rate, tax districts, 14 municipalities, all of them have to be set and everything has to be billed and levied. And then and only then do you have a calculation. We have made no assumptions, and in fact we've worked in our model to try to ensure that the tax districts remain whole on the sales tax front regardless of the change last year. So no, that did not go into the calculus for recommending or not recommending 18 tax districts. As the chart showed earlier, we think 18 tax districts would be a disservice to the taxpayer and onerous on the individual taxpayer, and is a much higher level of tax than necessary to fund fire service in the county. So no, it didn't. The sales tax is not the issue with 18 tax districts.
And if I just might add to that, and if you were to decide, although not our recommendation, to go to 18 separate tax districts and they would share in the sales tax, by contrast, the amount of money that you would have to fund through your ad valorem would be less because they were receiving those dollars. So to me, it's a non-issue because of the fact that they get money from one source or another source.
Right, you move, the slide kind of goes up and down to equalize. And you know, kind of like water will find its mark at some point. And that's kind of how that works is the slide would go up and down to equalize sales tax against property taxes. And by design, based on population or based on ad valorem levy. Now we do always have a discussion with one of our municipalities concerning how we allocate sales tax, which is a decision made years ago. And we're not recommending making that change. But going back to this, again, the fundamental issue is the level of tax rate necessary if you had 18 tax districts, not necessarily what the sales tax impact is going to be, because it's going to be what it'll be at the end of the day. And we can't make all of our decisions based on what 18 tax rates would be in addition to 14 municipalities plus the countywide rate. We would drive ourselves crazy because we'd be chasing our tail constantly. Where will the fund balances go? Fund balances generated from the supplemental tax component will be specific to the districts, because you still will be in those 4 of the 5, not Wesley Chapel because they are below the 4, they're at the 4.4 level. The supplemental taxes will still be under your service district model. So those will stay there. Just like schools, the remainder of the general tax dollar would be in a fire service fund, meaning it's segregated from the general fund, accounted for separately, will be available and seen on our books separately. So you as a commission would make that decision separately and fund them. No different than really the model we use to fund schools at this point. And as you have directed us last year's commission and setting those up separately. So the individual supplemental tax rates would remain in the districts. The county-wide version would remain in the centralized pot for fire service going into the future. And that would be more likely be used for rate smoothing at some point or for additional equipment if there was need. To me, it would fall into your similar roles to how you would use fund balance in the general fund. Generally, you'd want to focus on rate smoothing or one-time expenses. Should there be a group to address this issue? And this is kind of a complicated issue. The answer is yes and no. Yes, the issue from the perspective of establishing your service delivery model and kind of the standards that you want the VFDs to perform at, kind of no different, and I think the chairman's mentioned similar to EMS. I think from that perspective, if there should be a group, and you as a commission determine there should be a group, that it should be on the service level side. The EMS group was brought together to look at response times and deployment models and standards, performance standards in the contract. The EMS group did not, however, recommend to you sales taxes, property taxes, fees, fire fees, all these other things. So yes, I think the group is appropriate if the commission chooses to set the standards and the service delivery standards, but no, I do not think it's appropriate for that group to look at the funding mechanism or the source of the funds. And the reason why that is because they deal with fire service, not setting countywide tax rates and countywide financing information. You have experts on your staff that do that every day, and I think you should, in this case, rely on those that are charged with those duties within your county. Who decides what funding is provided under the recommended hybrid funding model? A lot of discussion, the manager did this, the manager does that. Remind you that the manager makes a recommendation. The Board of County Commissioners ultimately decides who gets what funding. The manager is statutorily required to present to you, and we're coming up on our deadlines, by June 1st, a balanced budget. In that balanced budget, there's no exception for VFDs. So as part of her balanced budget, she has to recommend to you a funding level as well as tax rates, fire fees, all those other components for you to review and adopt or modify and adopt. So the way I see it and the way that this works out is this is not changed from the way we do it currently. This doesn't add any more power or onus or any more authority to the manager's responsibilities. Those are clearly laid out under General Statutes, Chapter 159 in the Fiscal Control Act. She is the budget officer of the organization. So from that perspective, regardless of how we want to skin that cat, she has a responsibility under the law to provide to you a recommendation. This is no different than the way we've done it, at least in the last 3 years. And I'm not sure what before then.
The first year I met with all the chiefs and made a recommendation in 2011-12.
That's right. And because the VFDs under the current funding model, there's insufficient funding generally. She was making recommendations on general fund subsidy to begin with. So this doesn't really change that aspect of it. There's not been a fundamental change in how the resources are allocated across the county. Really only to how we tally the funding to get to fund the service side. Okay? Why can't the VFDs stand on their own and raise their funding as they did in the past? And we had this kind of discussion as we were moving forward with looking at the original discussion. I believe it was March 16th, if I remember right. The nature of fire service has changed. Standards have changed. Equipment standards, staffing standards, expiration dates on bunker gear, all these things that weren't around in the early 90s when the original contracts were set up, and even going back before that when fire fees were put into place. You know, we transitioned originally in the late 80s, early 90s from being able to fund fire service with bake sales, barbecues, turkey dinners, chicken and dumpling. We heard all kinds of different, pictures, fundraising activities, which are great. I think there's a community, part of the community. But because of the cost of fire service and the challenges faced by the VFDs, they are not able to raise enough money to provide for fire service. If they were able to raise enough money, you wouldn't have service districts, tax districts, or fee districts. So the way that the service is going, it's becoming a more costly service to provide. You're going to continue to see growth in the need for staffing, increasing cost for turnout gear, SCBA, trucks. All these things are not getting cheaper. But the ability of VFDs to raise money is becoming more of a challenge. And I think if you were to talk across the board to nonprofits, since 2008, probably even before then, there's a significant decline in their ability to raise money. And from that perspective, VFDs are no different. And I think that the original contracts, when the fire fee was $50, were put into place because the fire departments had trouble collecting their fee anyway. And the thought was that the county had a better ability, because of its longer reach, to collect that fire fee. So even going back as far as that, even when you had a fire fee structure in place, there was a challenge in collecting it. So I think that conceptually, I understand the thought that they're 501c3s, that they should, they're independent corporations, but they're not independent corporations from the perspective of they are not able to stand alone on their own funding. They are completely reliant on you as a board to survive going forward, because you set their funding level. In 13 of the 18, you directly subsidize them, and then in the other 5, you raise or lower their tax rates based on their request. So it's kind of an outdated thinking or philosophy that they as nonprofits are able to stand alone in the face of kind of this changing environment. Can the countywide fire tax be used in the future for another purpose? We had a lot of discussion about this, because in one regard, it's a very valid question. What happens in the future when, as Commissioner Helms likes to say, Cindy and I have moved on, the 5 of you are no longer here, then what? The North Carolina law and the way the general statutes work are purposefully protective, and I would say largely protective, of your discretion and protecting you from previous boards and protecting future boards from you binding their actions. So from that perspective, and I think it's a positive thing, I'm not saying that as a negative thing, that the board has discretion. You can't bind a future board, only in the cases of debt and in contracts that would generate future commitment. So you would not be able to stop that from happening in the future. But I will tell you, I think you create a moral obligation. When you break that tax rate out, just like the school's tax, that you create a moral obligation for the future boards to use that funding for fire service. And if the future commissions continue to choose to fund fire service in the county, then regardless of the funding source, there will still be a cost to providing fire service. So whether they, 20 years from now, change the name of the fire tax, move it back into the general fund, there's still going to need to be a funding mechanism of some kind. In addition, in our recommendation, you're not moving away from, or you're not eliminating your abilities under the current model. We would recommend setting all the fees to 0 and setting all the tax rates to the appropriate level. In Wesley Chapel, we'd recommend setting it to 0. And the others, it would be a penny, half a penny, depending upon wherever it's at specifically. This is really no different than the approach taken with the countywide supplemental tax for schools, which is set at 0 today, but still on the books. The Monroe City Schools tax, which is set at 0, but remains on the books. So this isn't a stripping away of abilities for future commissions. It's a recommendation to give a stable source of funding. So the answer to the question is, there's not anything you as a commission, regardless, can do to bind that future commission. And I would encourage you to, if you refer to maybe, I know Commissioner Helms, you mentioned maybe getting a special legislation or a local act to kind of focus in on that. Think think strongly about doing that, because anything that you do from Raleigh that binds your hands as a local commission takes that authority away from you and passes that to somewhere else in the state. So I think that the general statutes are purposely guarded against your ability and those that came before you's ability to bind you as a commission and those future commissions.
Isn't that what fire districts does today, though? I mean, we're bound to the money we collect in that district, that we
Only
use
to
it in that
the
district.
extent that in that fiscal year, the next year you can set that rate to wherever you feel the need. And that by very definition then changes how it moves forward. So you can set any of those tax rates to zero. Even in the Chapter 69 districts, the voted authority that you have for fire tax in those districts is not a vote for a specific VFD. It's not a vote to require a tax, not a vote to provide fire service. It's a vote to provide a funding mechanism, if you as a board so choose, to fund fire protection in that district through a tax. And in addition, you as a board can contract with whoever you see fit to provide that. So I think there's a misnomer out there that fire taxes belong to someone. Taxing authority is yours, and yours alone in this county. They do not belong to a VFD, does not belong to any part of the county. It belongs to you, and that's in your authority to make those decisions, even in those voted districts. So yes, within the year, you're bound to that. But when the next fiscal year turns, you can set that rate to wherever you see fit. Does
You
that make
also,
sense?
you bring up the fact of a contract. Where is our contract with our current volunteer fire departments? My understanding, it's 1990s version. Is that a fair statement?
It's a very old version of what needs updated.
Totally agree. So they're not obligated to sign a contract with you, and you're not obligated to sign one with them, is what you just said.
That would be correct. But I think realistically, I think that's under the law what the rules are. There's a practicality to this discussion that VFDs have debt. They have equipment. They serve the community. They're in the community. We as a county have an interest in them being in the community and being part of the community. So this is not, there's not a goal on any side of that equation for VFDs to stop being VFDs. Otherwise, we would be recommending something different. But there is a goal on one side of they are a vendor or contractor with the county, and we are trying to provide the most effective and efficient service possible at the lowest tax rate for the entire county. So there, in any relationship, contractual relationship, there's always a competing interest. And we'll have a little bit of discussion through those processes, but I feel confident that we can reach a solution that's best for everyone in Union County through those contract discussions. I don't think those contract discussions are going to hinge on the nature of the funding mechanism. Those contracts are going to refer to service levels, disposition of equipment, the reporting requirements, those things. And like in the EMS contract, if you review the EMS contract says nothing about the source of funding used to pay for EMS. That is something that you as a board decide. And I think that the fire funding with the VFDs will be the same way. That you have a service level in mind by choosing to fund fire service in the county, you want to provide a certain level of service. That then is the jumping off point with the VFDs to determine the cost of that service. Where that penny comes from, where that dollar comes from, is kind of, in my opinion, immaterial to the VFD. The fact that they'll get it and it'll be there based on the service delivery and the need, what they say their need is to deliver a service level, that's the key component to that discussion.
I think, from what I've heard, and the concern is not necessarily, not where the money comes from necessarily, because if you give $1 million, where it comes from, if it's sales tax or whatever, doesn't matter, or fire fee or whatever. The problem is how they're, whose is it? Is it ours? Is it theirs? Are they able to spend it in their own fire department, or is there a potential that it will be shared amongst many fire departments? So that's, I think, more of what I hear than where the money's coming from, is that who does the money belong to? And that's what I hear over and over.
Regardless of anything else, tax dollars belong to the county. So you as commission make that decision. The nature and the way service delivery is in all but one of the VFDs, they're all net takers. So for Hemby Bridge, for Waxhaw under the recommended funding model, for Stallings and for Mineral Springs, they are getting more than they're giving under the funding structure.
But Jackson
Jackson will be getting more than
will be, but have not been, right?
but they have been in the past because we've been subsidizing
The 21,600 supplement, they get that?
there's that supplement plus, well, Jackson in that case, because they were covered by their fire fee, it was $21,000 supplement on top of the fire fee. So, but under the hybrid funding model, you're able to get the tax rate at such a level that, like all of our other services, there is some movement and some redistribution of those resources around the county, because what you're trying to do is provide a county-wide, if you will, blanket of service, not ebb and flow or high, low levels of service across the county. So there's going to be in any service we provide at the county level, whether it's schools, social services, sheriff services, libraries, parks and recreation, you cannot trace back a dollar for dollar value to your individual small districts. What you can, though, is track the value to the entire county. So anywhere you go in that county, you have an expectation and can rightfully expect a level of service regardless of where you are in the county. And I think that would be true in this case, just like you can expect a base level of service from the sheriff or any of those other services, no matter where you are in the county. And that's kind of what you're aiming at. And there is some redistributive nature to that. There's no question about that.
And the concern that I would have would be that you have the population, and most of the population is in the western part of the county. And if they deemed it not important for my fire department in the eastern part of the county to have funding, could that be shifted around due to the vote of 3 commissioners? And that would be a concern, and I think that's something that is important. I mean, we would hope, our optimistic part of us would hope that would never happen, but I've seen unbelievable things before.
Well, my response to that would be, that's where you sit now.
I was about to say that happens today. That could happen today. It's at the, since you provide supplements now, you all establish the tax rates. There is no guarantee that any department will get any funding above and beyond
there kind of
what the
is.
Board of County Commissioners has established.
There is some protections now that they have to spend the fire fee or the fire tax in their district currently, right?
Only to the extent of the $100.
Right, but there is an extent.
Right, but exception of in 15 of Jackson and Baker's, in 16 none. None of them are spending less than that fire fee. So you as a commission, Unionville, for example, is 40% funded by the commission through the general county tax dollar, not through their fire fee. That 40% chunk of their budget, and it varies across the entire board, that is exposed already to the whim of the Board of County Commissioners. Now, you're absolutely right. That $100 fire piece, which is becoming a smaller and smaller chunk of that budget, is that, no doubt about it, has to stay there. But that's not enough to fund those fire districts at all. So I would argue you're sitting there already as a commission. You have that authority on that supplement. If you told Cindy to cut 0.67 out of the budget based on not wanting to supplement fire departments, all of those fire departments would lose significant funding, even under the current model. And that's kind of my point is, there's this thought out there that we are in some way already don't have a countywide fire tax. You do. It's just part of your county operational tax. It's just never been broken out before.
But it's 0.67.
It's 0.67, and if you went otherwise, and that's in addition to the $100 tax, the $100 fee. So if you went otherwise, the value of that is about 1.2 cents on the 2016 recommendation. So
I guess I'm a little confused then, because when we met and we discussed this in, I believe, a prior working session, we had talked about the hybrid model. And the idea was to establish a base level of service that the county would support, and then the individual fire districts would determine based on their their residents the level of service above and beyond that.
Right.
And what it appears is what you're proposing is that you wipe out as much of that supplemental tax as you can and provide countywide tax. And my issue with that is that kind of goes against what we had, my understanding was the direction of staff was to leave the supplemental tax in place, but be able to provide a base level of service.
And we did. You only have that ability in 5 places.
Okay?
5 of the 18. Okay? So we did in 4 of the 18 do that. In Wesley Chapel, it worked out differently because the county-wide rate ended up being slightly higher than what their localized rate would be. So yes, we maintained that autonomy and that ability above that level for the 4 of the 5 taxing districts. In those other 13 districts that were fire fee, there's not a mechanism in place to do an additional supplemental tax. Now, if they decided they wanted a supplemental tax in that district at some point in the future, they have the ability to petition you as a commission. That ability never goes away unless the state legislature changes that. So in thinking through that aspect of it, we feel like we fulfilled the direction you gave us in that we did put the supplemental tax rate in place where needed to fund what we would suggest are new or above that base level of service, particularly in the cases where they were adding either lots of equipment, additional staffing into next year, doubling their staffing in Waxhaw's case to staffing cost, maybe not staffing people, but or even in Hemby Bridge with about $155,000 of additional staffing cost. All those pieces of increases came at a localized tax rate level, not at the 4.4 level. So they're getting into their district the 4.4 plus then that additional to make that up. Does that kind of make sense?
It does, but my concern, and you've heard me say this over and over again, we go back to the tax rate. You're looking at the county funding 0.67 in 15, and now you're asking for 4.4 cents. That's a problem. I have a fundamental problem with that. And we've talked about that over and over again. I want to support the fire districts. I do. And we've talked about safety, security, life safety, but I have a problem with 4.4 cent increase on the taxes on top of the 15% that was recently put in place.
And I think I understand where you're coming from. The challenge in that is the determining what the effective value of the $100. You can't divorce the 4.4 from the $100 piece. So if you're charging me, the direction I feel like we receive all the time from the commission is lowest tax rate possible for the best level of service possible. What I'm recommending to you is that this hybrid model that we're recommending today is the lowest tax model that gets away from the fire funding fee, the fee funding model, and has the best impact on the taxpayer countywide.
Jeff, we need to move on
Okay.
because we committed to let a number of individuals speak. I got to say one thing though. You made a statement a while ago calling volunteer fire department takers. I can tell you, they have been givers for the last 60 years. We could not give them enough to compensate them for what they've done in the past 60 years in this. And I don't take that wrong. I'm not saying throw everything at it. I don't mean that. You said we don't have a contract with them. And from that standpoint, and I think some of the representatives here want to talk to that, because I cannot understand, and I understand what Commissioner Simpson's saying. How can you get a funding model when you don't even have a working model? And so from that, I mean, I know we've got several of our mayors here, and that's, maybe that's part of our root cause. We're not talking to our municipalities. Shame on us. I've had some great conversation with several of the mayors, and they were surprised by this. They should never be surprised from that. But I think we've heard basic. I think your last slide here of what's the plan if hybrid doesn't move forward, I'd like to hear that. And then I'd like to go to hearing what our citizens have to say.
And that's fine. be happy to finish.
Okay.
So the last question I think we addressed is what if the recommended hybrid doesn't move forward, the hybrid funding model? What we would recommend to you, in deference to the Commissioner Simpson's comment, we would recommend that you fund or that you freeze at the 2015 levels, including staffing. We believe there are two VFDs that are on probation, so we would recommend that you fund the additional staffing necessary to keep them, to move forward with getting them off probation. But everything else would come back to you at the 15 levels in all the VFDs except for those two. And we'd also recommend that we scrub out the capital at this point to try to get that cost as low as possible going forward into the next year. So this would be the recommended alternative if you didn't want to move forward with our hybrid funding model while we wait to do that, because I don't think without having some capitated cost or having some idea of what the frame around that cost will be, that funding the increases this year makes any sense from a financial perspective, because you don't know what that's going to be. You don't have any top end to that discussion going forward. So based on whatever those contracts and the outcome of any process could be, we would recommend then that you kind of hold that until that outcome is known, because you don't have any cap. We were asked to look at what if you broke out fire and EMS together. This is what your tax rate would look like for fire and EMS. The EMS is about 2.89 cents. That's up from about 2.2 cents in the previous year. So when you add those together, the countywide tax rate, excluding fire and EMS at this point, would be 0.2856. Your schools tax would be 46.75 cents. That's still being worked on because we are working through the calculation, so that's about. And then you'd have just over 0.7 cents or 7 cents for countywide EMS and fire. I think we actually duplicated. I'm going the wrong way, I'm sorry. So coming up real quick, our next steps in our process, our recommendation to you is we recommend the funding levels outlined with the recommended capital staffing increases and the countywide programs. We include also the funding structures in the recommendation with the supplemental tax rates. Based on this direction, we'll go forward and kind of finalize the manager's recommended budget. On May 4th, you'll receive that presentation. May 15th, we expect the Board of Education to provide their budget. May 18th, we'll have a public hearing concerning the manager's proposed budget, which will include whatever version of VFD funding you direct us to do. In addition, May 18th, you'll give a tentative approval to that. That's not the final approval, that's just tentative approval. We do have slated in our budget calendar a joint working meeting with the BOE. The May 21st, the manager will provide an addendum to the county manager's proposed, which will include the schools piece. June 1, the public hearing concerning UCPS. June 8th, and this is a intermittent meeting date. This is not in your normal calendar, and we'll be asking you to add this as a date for just for the public hearing on the budget, is your statutorily required public hearing. And then on June 15th, we would ask that you to put whatever direction you give us, the final county budget on your agenda and approve that. And that's your last meeting in June. The way the dates fell in June, they're the earliest possible dates they can be. So with that, all additional information, this presentation, including the white paper on funding, is available on our website. So with that, Commissioner, unless there's any other questions for me, I'll be happy to turn that back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Like I said, we have about 14 people that have signed up to speak. We've got roughly 30 minutes, so if you can keep it to a couple minutes. And we'll start with Jane Duckworth. Is that correct, Jane? Did I pronounce it?
I'm sorry, I just signed that as somebody who was attending.
Okay, all right, thank you, ma'am. Todd Elmore.
Hello. My name's Todd Elmore. I'm a member of the Union County Fire Commission. We had Chairman Blythe, I don't think, could attend tonight, so he wanted me to tell y'all what the results of our meeting was on April the 14th. We had a meeting last couple of hours. A lot of people spoke. Based on the results, we made a motion as a unanimous vote to recommend to the Board of County Commissioners that the hybrid method not be considered as a funding mechanism, and that we recommend a group of individuals, stakeholders, develop a funding solution and a contract solution. And this group consists of the county staff, the fire chiefs or a representative of the VFDs, the members of the fire commission, and representatives of the mayors or a representative of the towns in the county. That was it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Knupp?
Thank you for the time to speak. Speaking about really on behalf of the Fire Chiefs Association, and Chief Fitzgerald and Stephen, I'm sorry, I can't remember your last name, is up here with me as well, to make sure that I don't miss anything that we've covered within our meeting. To kind of keep it short, I was going to go through the history, and Mr. Yates covered that quite well. The fire fee was put in place to help the fire departments begin addressing the need for not being able to collect from the houses as they had been in the past. It was a history of going door to door, barbecues, the bake sales, so on and so forth, as he very well said. That got us to where we are today, a very accelerated of moving from the fire fee not being a sustainable model, which we as a Fire Chiefs Association do agree that the model that we're in is not sustainable. What we have of a difference of opinion in is the model that we're going to is the lack of planning. We have a model that is being put in place relatively quickly in our eyes that doesn't have a supporting contract behind it. There was a lot of questions answered even for me today that I wish that would have been made public a little earlier, but nonetheless there were some good answers and some good feedbacks given to us. I think the key though that I want to delve into is the fact that it was done outside of involving the volunteer fire departments. So there's a level of distrust, if I may say, that has been brought into the equation. You know, the fire departments were built by the community, for the community, and funded by the community, and quite honestly still do today, I guess, through the fire fees. As we move into this taxing district, we're taking that autonomy away from each of the individual districts. Yes, we do have 18 individual districts. Yes, they have different needs. I think there is some hybrid model that we can get to, and that the fire departments need to be involved with to get to that final point. I think if we go forward today, there's too many unanswered questions at least from the fire department standpoint, that we can't support it. Case in point was the capital. You know, I had asked, matter of fact, I was one of them that actually called in questioning my funding. There was things that we had requested and we didn't get. In specific, I was talking about some self-contained breathing apparatuses. They were pushed out to the following year. Our intent and our practice has been in the past that we build up funding to make these major purchases, as is several of the other departments around. And over the past several years, that funding mechanism has been pulled away from us. Therefore, building the ability to build up the funding sources for capital purchases has gone away. So we are now a victim, if you will, for lack of a better word, of the inadequate pre-funding. Understanding that the general fund provides a way to fund other departments that I wasn't aware of having the loan shark approach, if you will, for their funding. There's some viability to it. But again, there's no plan in place that the fire departments are aware of at this juncture that tells us how all this works out. If Stallings is going to get a ladder truck next year, how does that affect my tax rate? How does that affect my ability to get my truck? You know, I'd even asked the question when we were in with the staff, saying, how do we get those capital things allocated, for lack of a better way of saying it? And the answer was, well, right now we don't have a plan. So again, listening to all the questions that were up there, what it really reveals to me is there is a lack of communication between the fire departments and the county staff. I have, and I'm speaking for me personally, I have the utmost trust in the people that are on staff that have their fire service, Mr. Teague specifically. He's a very educated man, and I have the utmost confidence in Mr. Yates and his financing ability. What I think we lack, though, is from a county staff is the ability to understand the fire departments in totality. Yes, you understand the financing. Yes, Mr. Teague definitely understands how a fire department runs, but the dynamic that's missing is the individualness of those fire departments. One needs one thing, one needs something different. I also want to comment on the fact that in some of the presentations that I've obtained through the website, there's this question of standards, that we're not providing standards. I can assure you that from the state of North Carolina, each department is at a standard level of performance, the 9S or 9E, and I can go into those in detail if you'd like. However, yes, there are a couple that are on probation, but that asserts the fact that we're even being audited to those standards by a governing body outside. Just from a proposed plan, if I'm cutting to the chase, you know, in my opinion, I think we do need to back off of what is being asked to be pushed through. Go back to the same funding mechanisms that we used for this year, continue it for one additional year. It was said that we have a point, if I'm doing the math in my head, a 0.6 increase in the general fund moving forward. I understand that. You know, we can do whatever we can to whittle that down a little bit, but still move forward with that funding, keep everything in place, give us the time to work with county staff to develop a contract first, and then the funding model that defines that, that goes in conjunction with that, that contract, so that we're not in this state that we're in today of flux, or a state of no information, misinformation, whatever you want to call it. So that's where I'm kind of, where my comments lean to. There is definitely concerns with the general funding as far as the funds going into that fund. At some point, as was stated down the road, the next board could allocate that somewhere else. That is definitely a concern of mine. I tend to want my tax dollars to stay within my district because that's what my community expects of me, and they fund me accordingly. I think there's definitely different models that are available that we haven't brought to the table yet, and I think it's incumbent upon us as a group to do that. So in a nutshell, that's the stance from the Fire Commission, or the Fire Chiefs Association, that we would also not move forward with the proposed budget process. Go back to the for the short term where we are today. You can even take the capital funding that was presented, finance that over a period of 5 years, and I think the impact is going to be about $120,000 roughly in interest payments. To reinvest that, you can knock it down by another $30,000 by the interest that you would earn on that money if you set it aside. So I think, again, there's definitely short-term things that can be done. Long-term would be definitely getting the heads together and coming to a agreed-upon viable solution that is bought into by the departments as well as the county staff. Absolutely, you have every right under your elected positions to do what you want to. We recognize that. But we do ask that we be given a chance at the table to bring a funding solution that's appropriately funding all the departments and in a way that benefits us all. And that is sustainable. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Stephen, since you're standing next, I'm going to go ahead and call you up, maybe get out of order a little bit here. But
okay. Chairman Helms, Commission, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'll just echo what Chief Canup has to say. You know, the fire chiefs of the county have gotten together. We've looked at the various information that's presented by different representatives from county staff, and you know, we've come up with some pretty good ideas that we would like, you know, to share with the commission for consideration. Some of the things that I picked up during the presentation was, I think it was Commissioner Simpson asked, what would it cost additionally to fund all of the requests this year? And I think Mr. Yates said somewhere in a ½ cent range. You know, so we've got a 4.5 cent plan over here, and then a ½ cent range to make up the difference in the general fund. We're not advocating that we continue to kick the can down the road. We do agree that there is some changes that need to happen with the funding system for all the fire departments. The fire tax districts are sustainable in the way that they're designed, but there is a need for some change with the fire feed districts. But as Chief Canup illustrated, there is a plan there. If we look at funding the proposals that the county manager recommended this year for the tanker trucks for those organizations, the SCBA replacements, and you look at stretching those payments out, it has a less of an impact on the county budget. In addition to that, I'll just speak to a moment about Wesley Chapel Fire Department because we're a little bit unique in a lot of things that Mr. Yates was discussing, the ability that we're not consuming our 4.4 tax rate, and so we're net givers in this equation. And I do have several questions in regards to what the future holds for additional requests for Wesley Chapel Fire Department. Mr. Yates talked about the Horizon Plan projections, and we did participate in that. We've projected out different capital improvement plans in the future, such as our ladder truck that'll be coming up on 20 years of age in a couple years. So in a couple years, when we have a $1.4 million ladder truck needs to be replaced, if that takes up the difference between our effective tax rate and the 4.4, then how is that going to impact the other organizations? So we have to come back in a couple years and then ask for an additional tax rate. And I think maybe that was what Mr. Simpson was asking, is that there comes a point in time where you can't continue to fund all the capital and somebody has to continue to move down the list. So I think that, from the fire department stance, we don't have a lot of information on the clarity of what the future capital outlay is, other than the fact that we'll put in a recommendation. We hope that it goes through. But I certainly think that everybody can agree that we absolutely need to look at a sustainable funding solution. But I don't think that the 4.4 countywide tax rate is the best sustainable option this year. I think there's a tremendous amount of fire chiefs in this county that have a great, vast knowledge of their individual fire districts that would absolutely participate in a process throughout the county if we're given the opportunity. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. Mr. Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Commissioners, for allowing us to speak to you. I'll just take a minute because Chief Canup pretty much summed up what most of the points from the fire chiefs. But I think from holding the budgets flat for this year is not sustainable. I think that you need to consider looking at the budgets as proposed by the chiefs. I know in Waxhaw we look at responses to calls, number of people on calls, and we make staffing recommendations based off of that. And so to continue the way we are is not sustainable. So with that said, Chief Canup, I think, summed up everything else. So again, thank you for listening to us. We do appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Dennis Rape.
Thank y'all commissioners for the job you do. I am not with the fire department. I just came to speak on their behalf, and I have property in several fire districts. In 30 years of having houses scattered around this county, I've never had a fire that exceeded the deductible, and that speaks to a great fire department in Springs and Fairview and Allen's Crossroads. And I got some people down Allen's Crossroads don't know where the yard starts and stops and the house starts, so they've tried to burn some things there. But the things that concern me is on the presentation by Mr. Yates, I saw that it said that fire fees collected in a district would stay in that district, and yet then he turned around and said it would be the discretion of the commissioners to spend that money as they wanted to. I think I heard Commissioner Lance Simpson say that he thought we were talking about a half cent, which that's what I was prepared for before all this came up. I would encourage you to wait 1 year, put this off. I think the Fire Commission, even though y'all been trying to get them to present a plan since 2012, I think they got their pumps primed right now, and they can probably get you a plan pretty quick. Now, I was really shocked at a 4.4 versus they've been getting 0.67 plus fees. I think they've had their eyes open. We all know that the chiefs at all the departments are great people. I would encourage you to wait on this hybrid plan and get them involved, get the stakeholders involved. And I appreciate what you do, but I don't think this thing's ready for an approval.
Thank you, Dennis. Travis Stegall?
I'll say mine for our town manager.
Okay, thank you, Travis. William Oak? Okay.
Just a couple of things that I needed to bring up real quick. I live in the Allen's Crossroads district, Name's William Oak. I'm on the Fire Commission. And some figures were presented to me over the weekend, and I heard past weeks that the 4.4 of my fire fees would go down. My question is the fire fee figured on my residence and all my personal property? That's number one. And I understand that's the way it's supposed to be done. So all my vehicles and everything are going to be charged at 4.4. If I did some quick math this morning, I'm paying the $100 fire fee in Allen's Crossroads District. Under the new system, I'm going to be paying $157. I'm actually going up when they start doing all the personal property. So that's something I was not aware of. That is the case then. It's going to be on all personal property, the 4.4?
Do you want me to
Yes,
respond?
well, yes, please.
On a tax basis, it is, yes, on your personal property as well as your real property.
Okay, so on vehicles, and a citizen presented me with this, just for your information. He got this is a recent renewal of his tags, and it's already got on here, fire. And I took it to the assessor's office.
The reason it has fire on there because we have fire fees and we have fire tax rates today, so, and it is broken out separately.
If that's a motor vehicle renewal, and it has a fire tax on it, that means that they live in a fire tax district.
Well, I took it to the assessor's office, and she said that was in error. It's not even supposed to be on there. So I
It
said,
must be set at 0.
so I don't know what that is already. Maybe they're practicing already. But okay, that was my question.
Thank you, Bill.
My taxes and the people in my Allen's Crossroads, our fire fees aren't going down, they're going up.
Yes, sir.
And I live with you in Allen's Crossroads, and I think the point that we need to look at is too, that it would not be 4.4 for us. If we were in a fire tax district, it would be 6.51 or even, I saw another higher figure. So going away from the fire fee, if we fully fund our fire department like Hemi Bridge does, add more to that.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Oak. Patrick, is Nolan? Nyland, I'm sorry.
I apologize, my handwriting has not gotten better with age. I am the town manager for the town of Wingate. I was not planning on speaking, but since Wingate came up earlier, I just wanted to clarify a few things, what the town's been working on with the fire department. I've been manager for about 4 years, and ever since I got there, I've been working with Travis on trying to get them a new building. The building they're currently in was built in 1963. It is not designed to house the type of apparatus they need today. Our initial plan was to try to work with the county on building a building, and then the town would supplement their budget through additional tax. At the time, this was going on, so we didn't know what was going to play out. So the town took the lead and did a space needs study to the tune of about $40,000 to work with the town, work with the police department, work with the general administration to see if there was some cost savings if we all co-located together. Since that point, we have progressed a little bit farther and have decided to co-locate the town hall in the fire department. That building is going to cost about $3.5 million. An annual payment for that building is going to be about $180,000. Not all of that is going to be fire. We've calculated to be about $130,000 is what the town's going to contribute to fire service for that building. The building was identified in the Horizons need as an immediate replacement. They're having to custom build fire trucks to fit in the building because it's not big enough to house what they need. So while we have taken the $20,000 supplement away this year, we feel we've put it into an area that demonstrates a need that the fire department certainly has. And I can answer any questions, but I wanted to be as brief as possible explaining what the town, because I do think it only works if towns in the county are willing to cooperate on fire service moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Jack Parks.
Thank you, Commissioner, Chairman Helms, and Commission staff. As you said, my name is Jack Parks. I live in Weddington, where I've enjoyed being a resident of Union County for 26 years. I'm also the president of Providence Volunteer Fire Department. I'm speaking today to make you aware of a recent action by 3 of the 5 members of the Weddington Town Council that could have a devastating effect on our community, jeopardize our public safety, and destroy Providence Volunteer Fire Department, a fire department that has served Western Union County for over 60 years and has earned a commendable ISO rating of 4. This past Saturday, I received a letter from Anthony Fox, the attorney for the town of Weddington, stating that Weddington is going to keep the municipal funding for Providence flat for the 2016 budget year, which is the same as it's been for the past 2 years. Attorney Fox further states that if Providence cannot prove it can financially perform its obligations under the fire suppression agreement that we have with the town, that the town will cancel the agreement and contract with another fire department. I'm asking you today to give ample consideration to the budget needs of Providence Volunteer Fire Department and provide county funding, whether it be from a new funding model you adopt this year or from the county taxes our community already pays to supplement the department's municipal funding. I understand we all want to find ways to save money, and fire service is a big target, but it's also one of the most essential services we provide, especially when you include the first response medical attention provided by our EMTs. I encourage you to provide enough time for study so that funding for our fire departments will not only meet the needs of the people, but also be equitable financially for us as the taxpayers. I thank you for your service to the county and for this opportunity to speak, and I have copies of the letter that I received that I'd like to give to you for your records as well.
Okay. Thank you, Jack. Nancy Anderson.
Excuse me. Commissioner, staff, public, except for my time in college and in the military, I've lived my whole life in Weddington. And but if the truth be told, I consider myself more a resident of Sweet Union than just of Weddington. Although Weddington is an important, small but important part of a much greater whole, I see this as a whole, not as just one little municipality. And as I no longer have to speak for the town of Weddington, I'm speaking to you from my heart. I'm absolutely in favor of the core principles that were outlined by Mr. Yates. I think that everyone in the county deserves good public safety and fire and rescue. I don't think anyone disagrees with that. Public safety is a legitimate government responsibility. Residents, is clear that the residents in the western part of the county are going to be paying more. Weddington has always been a donor municipality in whatever county function it is. That's just the way it is. I myself, if this plan goes forward as it is proposed, I'm looking at about $1,000 a year increase in my tax bill. And you're going to hear a lot of objections from people who don't want to pay for a fire truck on the other side of the county. But I'll remind you that not too many years ago, we raised the school tax to build new schools in the western side of the county. And I'm sure that the people who lived in the eastern side, resented that and didn't want to pay extra. But we are a county as a whole, and you are responsible for the whole county. But I do have some concerns. I totally agree with the Fire Commission's recommendation that we form a working group similar to the model that we used for the EMS. And we need to have the bean counters, and I say that with great admiration and respect for the people who count the money and take care of it. But we need to have the subject matter experts. This room is full of people who know about fire suppression. But we also need to have the paying public represented in that. And I know that you guys represent us, but still, how it impacts us as individuals needs to be looked at. And I have a couple of questions for that, for them, for this commission. I want them to tell me, or the study group, what is it that we really need? And what level of service are we willing to pay for? And do we need to pay for it all at once? Do we need to do it all this year? Can we do it, put things off? We have all put things off in our own personal budgets that we can put off for another year. As with all of the other county services, as you have discovered, one size fits none. Here, our county is too diverse. We have too much density difference. I'm also concerned about when I hear people say, we would review the budgets. We're going to take all your money, we're going to review the budgets and distribute the funds. Who is we? Who is we? I want the subject matter experts to have a louder voice in what we need and how to distribute the funds. They know far more about this than you or I could ever hope to know. Also, would love to see if there's any way to have a dedicated line item. I know everyone for this particular thing. I know that we have talked about it's our intention, we planned this, but you're not always going to be here. They're not always going to be here. And this could look a lot like the Highway Trust Fund. And we all know how that has turned out. Union County, again, has been a donor county. A lot of money that we paid in left and went someplace else. So if we're going to build this as public safety money, we need to ensure that it's for public safety. And I like Steve and the others. I think you set your funding. Funding follows your plan. First you establish your plan, then you figure out how much is it going to cost to pay for that plan. It goes back to what I said before. What is it that we need? They can tell us that. What level of service am I, the paying public, willing to pay for? And do I have to buy it all in the first year? So, thank you very much for your time, and I know this is a very difficult time of the year for all of you. Very many meetings that you have to go to, and just thank you for your service.
Thank you, ma'am.
Can I just say one more thing, please?
Yes, ma'am.
Can someone fix the clocks in here?
Mayor Kilgore.
If it's good evening or good afternoon, but nevertheless, I am Mayor Kilgore. I'm here to represent our citizens of Monroe. And of course, the point, I don't know if it's 4.4 or 4.5, I've heard all these different numbers. But we feel that we are already adequate in the fire service. And I'm here to say for our citizens, certainly, we have a fire department that's very adequate, has covered our city for many years. Also, we have the EMS in there also. We have the emergency technicians. We have the trucks on call. We feel like we're doing very adequate service of that. We feel the city of Monroe is adequately covered. And therefore, I propose against the 4.4, simply because our fire department, I'm saying this to say that, our department is accredited number 3 out of 10, which is excellent. I heard one say a 4, which is very excellent in their community. Not only that, we have a fire department that's accredited in the state. On this accreditation, I don't know exact number, but we're probably one of 12 across the state, and I'll give that to Mr. Fowler there, that is accredited. So that is a very, very statement to make when you got a department with all these accreditations, as well as some of these county departments has got. So therefore, what I'm saying is I feel like it's wrong to charge our citizens another 4.4 or 4.5% for fire protection that they have already got and that we don't need, that we're doing adequately across the city. Therefore, it's another 4.5% tax rate. We can call it a tax service, we can call it a fire service, but when it's 4.5 cents, it's still 4.5 cent tax rate. That's what it's going to raise the county property tax. So for the citizens of Monroe and for myself, I want to say that I think we're very adequately covered. I hope that you will take some of these people, whether you go back with a committee or what you do is study this proposal, see what's adequate, what everybody can support. I think I would recommend doing that to you. Of course, I understand y'all have the ultimate authority to do what you like, and I respect that. But if you will, I think that you really need to look hard at this. I don't think it's right to put another 4.4 on our citizens in Monroe when we already have the adequate service that I have talked about. Not only that, the 4.4 will hurt us on the economic development at some point. When these companies come into the city of Monroe and when these companies come into Union County, certainly they look at the level of service that we in the county, and we are the county that provide. But if they in Monroe, they're going to say, well, we feel this is adequate service, or we're going to pay another 4.4. And I'm afraid that that's going to hurt us bad on that. And not only that, if it hurts us as a city for an industry, if we lose an industry, it also hurts the county. Because the city, as you know, and I've been told many times, is the county, and we respect that. So thank you for what you do. Thank you for giving me the time to speak with you, and I hope you will take that into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Next, we have Ms. Duncan.
Good afternoon. I'm Deborah Duncan. I'm also with the Monroe City Council, and I'm here to speak with you. But first, I would like to echo what the chairman said. Firefighters do an outstanding job, and we certainly support them. Mayor Kilgore and I both spent over 30 years in public service, so nobody supports our firefighters more than we do. But it's not about that. It's about the citizens of Monroe having to pay extra tax. And, you know, to say that we give back to the city 1 cent on the dollar, $3,500 or $350,000, using your finance director's words, is inadequate. And that word speaks volumes. It is inadequate. Not only inadequate, but also unfair. And we use the, you know, the comparison about the sheriff's office. The sheriff's office is in the city, or in the county, and we have police in the city, and we also are taxed. But that's like comparing apples and oranges, because we do get benefits with the jail and also with our civil processes, just to name a few. So that's really not a fair comparison. And I would like to address the comment about, you know, you don't need to consult with any municipality before making a decision. While that's certainly true, you do have the discretion to do whatever it is you would like, and that is true. Well, police officers also have a discretion on whether to write you a ticket or whether to give you a warning. And just because they can write you a ticket, because they have that discretion, doesn't mean that they should in every case. Sometimes they need to give you a warning ticket because it does build goodwill. And so what I'm asking is that we work together. It's not conducive to have a good relationship if you just work by yourselves without involving the other cities in the county. So let's work together. We are all in this together, and come up with something that we can all live with, and come up with something that will be adequate also for the citizens of Monroe. And again, I would like to thank you for your service, because I know firsthand what a tough job it is to balance the budget. We're doing the same thing. So thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Michael Smith.
Thank you, gentlemen. A lot of the points that I had, my name is Michael Smith. I'm with the Town of Weddington, and I also sit on the Town Council. A lot of this comments that I had already been addressed during the presentation. But I guess the one thing I want to say now is you need to work with the municipalities. Reach out to them, get their advice. They're represent the stakeholders, the taxpayers in this deal. I think it's also important that you also reach out to the fire chiefs, maybe get some input. I'm not saying that you have to do what they say, but at least have a roundtable discussion with them. You used some really good sound judgment when you were dealing with the EMS. And I'm asking you to use that same sound judgment here. You applied the brakes at the right time, you convened a panel, you took a second look at it. This has some serious tax implications that, from what I can hear, hasn't been worked out yet. So, before you impose this, please know what you're doing and what the implications are. And I think you have a lot of fine resources here within your fire chiefs, within the leaders within the municipalities, and I'm hoping that maybe you could reach out to them. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. And that concludes our speakers. Any comments? Yes, sir.
I have
Commissioner
one.
Gresham.
And we've heard from a lot of different people tonight. We've heard from a lot of different directions. And over the past week, 2 weeks, we've been talking to a lot of people one-on-one as well. And there's some things that we all need to realize as a community, that we all do have different needs and different situations. For example, a person living in a mobile home worth about $30,000 is probably paying an effective tax rate of $1.09. So when we talk about going up in price 4.4 cents, imagine the people on Stack Road Fire Department if they had to go to 20 cents extra. So not just 4.4, but 20 cents. Imagine the effect on a business wanting to locate in the Stack Road Fire Department district. That business would be paying 20 cents. He's not going to locate there. He's going to locate somewhere with a lower tax rate. So it does have an effect on where people move, where they buy their homes. It has an effect on a great deal of things. And our staff has taken a few jabs, not bad. Everybody was respectful. But what they did is they have worked for, I think, 3 years coming up with a plan to make sure that the fire departments have more money. And that's a noble thing that they've done, because I can tell you just as many in here are for the fire departments getting funding. There are many citizens out there that would say they don't need any more money. And I disagree with that. I think that you need to be able to fund. I think if I get in a car wreck in Weddington, I want Providence Fire Department or somebody to come and get me. I want somebody to help my kids, and I want to make sure that they're safe. I think if I'm in New Salem going to visit my family, I want to make sure that somebody's going to come get me and that we're going to be safe. So we do need to take a step back, and we do need to include the fire departments. And Chairman Helms and I were in the agenda meeting last week, and we were talking about this, and we both agreed that, and we disagree on some things in this, but we're very close on a lot of things. We both said that we need the firefighters to come in tonight and have their say, and have put out, and the public needs to come out and have a say in what we're about to do. But what I don't want to do is everybody get afraid of what we do, because it may be 4.4 cents next year. And I don't want everybody thinking that the 4.4 cents means anything bad, because it's actually the lowest that they came up with. It's actually the least that they came up with. So whether it's 4.4 cents next year or 3 cents or 5 cents, we don't know, but we have to talk to our fire departments. We have to get our community input in this and take time to make a right plan. We need contracts with our firefighters to make sure that the taxpayers of this county, including the city of Monroe, whenever we are funding, and we are already funding through the general tax rate, which you're already paying right now some of your money. And I've heard the 6.7 cent or 0.67 cents versus 4.4. It's hidden in other places, and we need transparency. We need people to know that we're paying for fire service with this money, not that we're just blowing it on things and buying county cars or vehicles with it. So we do need to, Chairman and I talked a lot about this, and we've had discussions back and forth. And I know some of you have been frustrated with me, because when I've talked to you, I've said, well, what about this or what about that? Chief Knupp, we spend a lot of time on the phone and even face to face. That's what it's going to take. That back and forth, talking this out and figuring out the proper funding model that's the right thing for all the taxpayers of Union County. I appreciate you coming here. I know that we both wanted you here to say this and hear what you had to say, and I think the chairman's got a good plan for moving forward.
And I appreciate that. Jeff, I want to thank you for the work you put into this. You provided a lot of good information, and you might be surprised we agree on more than we disagree on. I think that, Ms. Duncan, you hit the nail on the head, and we need to work together. And I appreciate everyone being here tonight and sharing their ideas on this. We were very successful in coming up with an EMS contract, and I guess I'd like to make a motion that I'd like to make a motion we hold off the implementation of the countywide fire tax until we seek the input from our stakeholders. We need to cancel the funding of the 3 fire trucks and the bush truck and the 4-wheeler, which is over $1 million in funding. But we need to hold the volunteer fire departments to the funding of last year's model. And I heard, I think, Mr. Fitzgerald's comment. There are things such as the turnout gear, the air packs, and staffing that we still need to look at, but taking that capital away and tweak that. This can be done part of our normal budget process. We need to set up a community stakeholders board to study and recommend the volunteer fire department contract. I totally agree. You can't price something when you don't know what you're going to have. So we need that contract that sets what the county expects of the volunteer fire departments, and also what you can expect from us too, because you're business entities as well, and you need that information. And they need to address the needs of the fire departments and provides a financially sustainable model for years to come. Only model I've seen is this year's model. This board should include, and this is up to question, like 3 of the volunteer fire departments that are in tax districts, and about 5 of the fire fee districts, so we get a good cross section of what we're going to fund across. We need to have municipality representatives, community business representatives, and agricultural representatives, because it affects them all. This board should return to the Board of Commissioners no later than January 15th, 2016, with the above recommendation. And this will give us time to implement a new model by July 1st, 2016. Any comments?
Can I ask for clarification?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Just for clarification on the funding level
Yes.
that you're going to ask us to come back with.
Since we have to give you a budget in 2 weeks.
My recommendation, as we kind of put in the slide, on holding at the 15 funding levels, while this group is trying to work out what that should be, I think that your 15 should be your base working forward. Because trying to go through, and you kind of mentioned a couple of pieces of equipment on the capital side and kind of picking at it a little bit here and there,
Yes,
which is fine. My recommendation to you is being the implementation at this point going forward, that we have the 15 at hand. You're talking about 6 months for the fire commitment for that committee to kind of determine what it wants to do and recommend to you as a board. I think building up the base of any of the fire departments at this point with additional staffing and building on additional costs that are going to be ongoing costs into the future, until you have that plan in hand, if you're not going with the plan the staff's recommending, then I would recommend against building that base up, because you don't have that plan in place to know what that's going to be, and it may be something different. So you're adding to the base cost ahead of that process. So if that's the process you truly want, my recommendation to you would be just freeze at the 15 levels, excluding the one-time pieces of capital that were funded last year, and then that base will be reset by that working group as it goes forward to develop that service level and that recommendation. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, I understand.
And I think, if I may,
Go ahead.
I think maybe what you're saying is like we can come back and appropriate more funds when we get that. I mean, it's not.
Only if we have a funding source, because if you were to move forward with staff's recommended budget under a different funding model, it will require a tax increase in the general fund above the 0.67 cents that we presently use to fund fire, which is why I think Jeff is going to, what our recommendation was, that if the board did not want to go in this direction, we certainly appreciate that, is that to freeze the status quo, and I would say with the exception of the 2 departments that are on probation, and one of the reasons they're on probation is because the inability to turn out. So it was for some additional staffing for them to be able to ensure that they meet the state standards.
I agree, and that's why I made that reference, because I knew there were departments.
We just want to make sure we get clear.
If we don't freeze, we raise tax. If we freeze.
Right, that's kind of your trade-off where you're at this point. Is we looked at it earlier. We think that you could probably get it in within tenths of a penny either way, and part of that is resultant of the reval, not necessarily because of the change. And I think the county-wide radio program is predicated on a county-wide radio program. So, and I would argue that we need to do that because we did take funding for radios out of the equation. So my recommendation to you would be, if that's the goal, and I completely recognize that that's the direction you want to go, and I have no problem in going forward with that. To be able to move forward with the clear without raising that base. Otherwise, in some of those tax districts, based on their request, without having the rest of that conversation, you're going to see significant increases in their localized tax rate. And I think that you want to avoid that ahead of a decision, whether it be a county county-wide hybrid funding model, what that rate should be, if it's 4-4, if it's 5-4, if it's 3-4. Until that kind of settles out, and adding significant costs and significant tax rate within your fire districts, I think that you're getting a little ahead and increasing the base so that even when that group meets, you'll already have a predeterminate in that process. So my recommendation to you, if that's the direction you want to go to better facilitate that discussion, is to hold the base at the 2015 level.
Okay.
With the exception of those two probationary, let us move forward with the countywide radio program. And it's kind of immaterial in the conversation on tax rate because it's out in tenths of the pennies. But we will ensure that the radio program is taken care of. We'll also, we would also then go forward with that working group, if that's the direction, to try to determine then what that base should be without having some predeterminants based on this year's budget request.
Well, I think you said you took the radios out and put them separate from the fire funding. So that's part of your normal budget process. I agree with freezing it to 2015 and addressing the individual fire departments that have problems meeting the state requirements. We have to address that. With those amendments, like discussion on the motion.
Were there any life safety items in the budget request this year that absolutely had to be funded?
Well, it's kind of two
capital needs.
We think that obviously we recommended a level of funding, but that's a long-term sustainable strategy that we believe is sustainable going forward. In the interim time frame between here and January or next year's budget process, to say that we believe any of those are necessarily going to put, in our interpretation based on our conversations, I don't believe so. If some of those VFDs came to us and said that was the case and made the case and we felt that way, I believe we'd probably come back to you and argue that. There is still flexibility, and I think this is the other thing you have to remember. Absent of a funding change and everything else, they still have flexibility within their own fund balances on their side of the ledger. They have cash balances in their own bank accounts. So to provide the services that, and the lack of control at this point that the commission has through contracts, they can reallocate funding as necessary from their own bank accounts, from other sources, to be able to meet those needs. So I would expect that a VFD and a chief of a VFD would prioritize his costs and his cash on hand to be able to continue to protect life safety, regardless of what you as a commission did under the existing model. They have that flexibility built in.
Okay. All right. Yep. Commissioner Simpson.
Just curious, I think the effort is laudable. My question is, what is the relationship of this committee to the Fire Commission with regard to their role?
I see them as an independent entity, and which I would see the Fire Commission as recommenders, as they have they've been in the past. And nothing to say that Fire Commission members wouldn't be applicable to have on this this committee. We had that in the past, and we've got some Fire Commission members that've got close to 30 years managing these departments, and so that's a valuable resource. Okay.
So who are the players going to be on this panel, committee, whatever you call it?
Well, my suggestion was volunteer fire departments, fee and tax representation, and the agricultural community, because it's a major impact in looking at changes we do there. Municipalities, like Mayor Kilgore and their staff discussed tonight. Business leaders, like yourself. You know, what's the impact going to be on the business? And just regular citizens. I would see this board being somewhere, we had 18 on the EMS thing. Maybe 18's the right number, you know, maybe 21 is. So it's a little different voting. But it's our community coming together. I talked to the commissioner that put together the fire fee program that we had back in the 90s. And, you know, yes, it's broken. It's broken now, but that's 25 years it's been in place, so it worked somewhat for a number of years. And they, in their wisdom at that time, they had what they called a blue ribbon committee. It's the same thing. Of the community came together and tried to work this out. They didn't come up with a perfect model that lasts forever, but it's lasted the county a long time, and a lot of our departments have grown considerably. So I think our community can come back together and help us develop a financially sustainable and one that works for the county as well for the individual fire departments.
So if I understood correctly, we're going to freeze the funding then at last year's or the current year's level.
Yes.
Now, I think I heard you say, and I just want to make sure I understand this, that the apparatus, or I guess the equipment, you want to put that off as well?
That's correct. It's over $1 million. It's
I don't disagree,
unprecedented.
but I guess my question is any of that absolutely necessary that they have it right now?
The questions I've asked from a number of chiefs, and I haven't come back that is absolutely necessary right now.
As long as you can tell the citizens that no, that equipment's not needed, and if anybody loses their life, then that's on your hands. So
all right.
I'm comfortable with that.
I have to.
For the record, Helms
kind
said
of
it wasn't
things.
needed.
That's fine.
The last recommendation I would ask that there be a commissioner representative on this board.
Oh, I agree.
And I would ask that Jerry Simpson serve in that role. So
okay.
With that, I support your panel, and I think it's a good effort.
Okay. So, and with
Mr. Chairman, too.
Yes, sir.
If you know, how did y'all put together your panel when you had, like, with you and Jonathan Thomas went around with the EMS and met and did stuff with that? How did y'all put that together?
It was kind of agreement of staff and commissioners that agreed upon a representatives of, you know, we had, the sheriff's department hadn't been included in any EMS discussion, so we determined they need representation. I saw Mr. Bailey walk in, and very appreciative of the service he gave us during that too. And so it was a little bit of
yeah. Well, then maybe we should come at the next meeting or something with the recommendations, or
the actual individual makeup. And I agree with you. I think it would be an excellent amendment to come the next meeting with recommendations of who to put on this board to go forth. And
one other suggestion, that maybe a friendly amendment or just another suggestion. I would love to work with Jerry on that. You know, we do, you know, be a standing committee meeting, but it would give it more. You know, like if Jerry comes back, I've seen one commissioner get worked over on, you know, by other commissioners. So, you know, Jerry,
That's fine with me.
Yeah, I'd like to help Jerry with that. I'd be glad to work with Jerry on that.
Be fine with me.
yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, there's been a lot of discussion since you made the motion. I was going to ask that so that staff has clear direction if the clerk could repeat the motion.
All right, it's that we hold off implementation of the countywide fire tax until we seek input from our stakeholders. We need to cancel the sourcing of the 3 fire trucks and 1 brush truck and 1 4-wheeler. We need to hold VFD funding at 2015 level, with the exception of the 2 fire departments that have dire financial needs for staffing.
That's the radio program, sorry.
Radio program I see is outside.
Actually, it was included in the 440. So since it's not in the general fund budget, we need for you to include that, sorry.
Include the radio program associated, because they need that. Need to set up a community stakeholders board to study and recommend a volunteer fire department contract that addresses their needs and provides financially sustainable model for years to come. My recommendation was a board that consists of 3 of the tax districts, larger fire departments, and 5 of the fee districts. Commissioners, which would be Jerry Simpson and Stoney Rushing, agricultural representative, and community business representative. That this board should return to the Board of Commissioners no later than January 15th, 2016 with the above recommendations. This would give the Board of County Commissioners time to implement the new model by July 1, 2016.
Thank you, sir.
Clarification on the freezing of the 15 funding. I assume you're referring to the operational funding because the one-time capital items, those were purchased in 15, there's not a need to repeat the funding.
That's correct.
For those in 16.
We don't, that truck's,
We bought it.
it's done, that's a done deal.
So
That's,
they don't need that funding again. I just
Yeah,
want
that's
to be sure
correct.
because I have to go back and direct my staff tomorrow to go through and do this.
okay.
So your motion was to freeze the 15 funding with the exception of the 2 probationary districts. And in so doing, regardless, you will eliminate the capital funding list from the equation.
So this year.
For 16?
Yes.
Okay. I just
Okay.
want to be real clear as to what your expectation was.
Any other questions?
Mr. Chairman, did you have in there to come back with the recommendations for the members of the next meeting?
No, that's a good point. And we'll add to this as well that by the, what is that, the May 4th? May 4th meeting, commissioners will work to come back with recommendation of those participants in that board. Any further questions? All in favor? Aye. All opposed?
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank everyone for taking their time and coming tonight. I move that the board go into closed session to consult with an attorney in order to preserve the attorney-client privilege and to consider and give instructions to an attorney in accordance with GS 143 318.11A3 concerning the handling of settlement of the following judicial action, Union County Board of Education versus Union County Commissioners. Okay, all in favor? Aye.